Hi everyone, it's John. Welcome back to my channel. It is stardate 06202023, and before we go too quickly headlong into the third quarter of Historathon, I figured I would talk a little bit about, in more of a long form way, one of the books that I read for quarter number 2. I passingly mentioned this in a video I did 3 or 4 weeks ago for something I showed you for Friday Reads. I mentioned that I think I was starting it, but I finished it a couple of weeks ago. And this is the book. It is Christine de Pizan's The Book of the City of Ladies, with that wonderful cover there. As you can see, they are building building a wonderful little city there, and I'll tell you about the city in the body of the review. This will be one of those reviews where I think a good amount of biographical detail and background of the author is important, so I'm going to include some of that. Hopefully it's not too boring. And I also opened the last video, the Friday Reads, with a quote, the very opening paragraph of book 1 of the book, and I just wanted to reread it because I thought it sets such a wonderful scene and in turn sets the tone for the book. One day, I was sitting in my study, surrounded by many books of different kinds, for it has long been my habit to engage in the pursuit of knowledge. My mind had grown weary as I spent the day struggling with the weighty tomes of various authors when I'd been studying for some time. I looked up from my book and decided that for once I would put aside these difficult texts and find instead something amusing and easy to read from the works of the poets. As I searched around for some little book, I happened to chance upon a work which did not belong to me but was amongst a pile of others that had been placed in my safekeeping. I opened it up and saw from the title that it was by Matthiolus. With a smile, I made my choice. Although I had never read it, I knew that unlike many other works, this one was said to be written in praise of women. Yet I had scarcely begun to read it when my dear mother called me down to supper, for it was time to eat. I put the book to one side, resolving to go back to it the following day. And she comes back to it, she reads it, and she's really kind of disappointed at how this book, which supposedly praises the intelligence, the abilities, the fortitude, the virtue, the honesty, all of the virtues of women, are really just sort of backhanded, misogynistic complaints about women. And I guess that's not too much of a surprise because, as we'll go on to learn, when she wrote this, that was kind of par for the course for almost everyone to think. And so it spurred her to write this book. First, a little bit about Christine's life. So, like I said, this is how she opens the book. Christine de Pizan was born in 1364 and died in 1431. And in it she gives, I think, some really good evidence that the phenomenon of light reading, as we can see in that paragraph, the phenomenon of needing something light and airy to read after a heavy period of study is much older than Goodreads or BookTube. We all need to pick something up that's a little fluffy after a long day of study. Christine was one of the first women to make her living as a professional writer in late medieval France, a privilege largely afforded to her by her father's position as the court astrologer to Charles V. Charles V, I should say, the King of France. After the death of her father and brother, who died just 1 year apart in 1388 and 1389, respectively, she quickly needed to find a way to support herself. And she started writing two fairly common medieval forms of French poetry, one called the Virelais and the other one called the Rondeau. And these quickly drew the attention and admiration of the French court. After attaining an established place at the court, which she did quickly, she wrote her first defense of women called The Tale of the Rose in 1402, which attacked a writer by the name of Jean de Meun, who espoused this really popular idea that women were little more than lustful and deceitful creatures, in a book that he wrote, very, very influential book that he wrote called The Romance of the Rose. The reason we remember her today, however, is her really righteous defense of women at a time when nearly every major literary voice just dripped with rampant misogyny. And that defense gave birth to this book, one of the foundational books of early Christian humanism. So the text is split up into three parts and is presented as a dream allegory, a really common literary technique at the time, a much earlier exemplar being Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. Most of the text is given over to biographies of women who make Pizan's case for her. Let me just show you what that looks like. So, just for example, just opened up to a random page here, and this figure has actually made the rounds in BookTube before, because I know Erica and a couple other people have mentioned her, but on this page here, you can see that we get the tale of, what's her title? Princess, Empress, Fredegunde, and other queens and princesses. But these are kind of just, I would just call them potted sort of biographies. They're really short. They're usually somewhere between 1 and 3 pages long. And there's a lot of them throughout the book. So she gives, like I said, these short biographies of these women that make her case that she's trying to argue. In doing this, she draws really closely from writers like Boccaccio, who wrote a book called, excuse me, On Famous Women, or De Mulieribus Claris in Latin, which was composed about 40 years before Christine wrote her book, sometime in the 1360s. Once Christine had expressed her discontent with the prevailing attitudes about women, she's visited by 3 allegorical women of her own. These women sort of come to her in a dream vision. They are Lady Reason, who visits her in part 2, Lady Rectitude, who visits her in part 3 of the book, and then Lady Justice, who visits her in part 3. Note that there are 3 women here, again, echoes of a Christian trinity. Each figure in turn, each woman in turn, helps her build her allegorical city, her city of women, built on the virtues of women and populated by women. In part 1, Lady Reason lays the intellectual foundations for the city. She convinces Christine that her male contemporaries have effectively gaslit her and women into believing that they are merely defective men, which was an idea that had gained popularity with the rediscovery of the Aristotelian corpus just a few centuries before Christine was writing. Lady Reason tells Christine that she needs to look on women from her own perspective and trust her own ability to formulate good arguments. In part 2, Lady Rectitude helps Christine build the houses and the walls of the city, and regales her with stories of women who have displayed virtues like propriety, honor, chastity, and the other so-called feminine virtues. Again, we are in the early 15th century here, so we are going to get varied, you know, these are women's virtues. In part 3, Lady Justice helps Christine attend to the final details of the city, including choosing a queen to rule over it. And in the end, Christine ends up exhorting all women to attend well to their cities, a sort of 15th century equivalent to Voltaire's advice that we should cultivate our own gardens. And while Pizan's place and the history of her text is really fascinating, I think the reading experience is a little less so. And let me describe why a bit. The disquisitions between Christine and each of the three women, reason, rectitude, and justice, are really the highlights of the book because they do a really beautiful job at illustrating how baseless and, of course, absurd the prevailing misogyny of Pizan's male contemporaries really are. And I shouldn't just say male contemporaries. I mean, this is misogyny that had been, that was adopted by a lot of women too, because it was just the air and the water you breathed and swam in the Middle Ages. It was just misogynistic through and through. So it really takes a clear, fresh mind to make the case that this is just a bunch of BS. And here are the women who make my case, and I can make a really, really convincing case too. The problem with the execution in the book, which can only be described as kind of violently and maliciously beating an already dead horse. The problem is this: when a few examples would suffice to make Christine's point for her, for whether it's the chastity of women or whether it's their intelligence or their virtue or honor or dignity, whatever, she never fails to make the case with a few dozen instead. In book one alone, remember, book one is only the first third of this relatively short book. She talks about 92 different women. In book two, she talks about 36 in book one. In book two, she talks about 92. And in book three, she talks about 37. And I understand that she's trying to drive home some very important points to her contemporary readers. But for someone reading this in the early 21st century who is hopefully already fully convinced that women are not malformed men, or little more than horny dissemblers, devoid of all virtue, the reiteration of the same argument over and over again with just different women can get a little tiresome. Another minor quibble is that I think she kind of undermines her own argument by resorting to so many fictional women. I haven't run the numbers, but easily most of the women she discusses throughout the book are figures for which we have no historical evidence. Many of them, like Cassandra, Andromache, Jocasta, Juno, Medea, Helen of Troy, Thisbe, I could go on and on just like she does, are pulled directly from Greek and Roman mythology. A select few are drawn from the Old Testament. It seems like choosing real historical women would have made a much stronger case for her. And certainly she would have had no shortage to draw from. And I think had she just chosen the historical women to make her case, that would have been a really strong case. But she adds a lot of women that we really have no historical evidence to believe that they ever existed, which kind of attenuates the strength of the argument. Anyway, on the upside, this makes an excellent primer for anyone interested in brushing up on their Old Testament or I should say, Jewish Bible and Greco-Roman mythology. As I was reading this book, this kept coming back into my head. In the late 90s, when I just started high school, I was a member of the Junior Classical League, and we had this event called Decathlon, which maybe some of you out there remember this. It consisted of 10 different events: reading poetry, rhetoric, geography quiz, Greek and Roman mythology quiz, etc. 10 different subject matters. My specialty that I actually went to nationals for was Greek and Roman mythology, and that was my super strength in high school. And you remember those condensed Edith Hamilton Greek and Roman myth books and the Bullfinch Greek and Roman myths? I used to read those endlessly over and over again until the spines would crack and the pages would begin to fall out. And reading this really made me think about those days. Excuse me. Which is how I would spend much of my summers back then. Because I was quite the hip and really popular high school student, as I'm sure you can tell. So I ended up giving this review of 3 stars on Goodreads. It's the best way I could kind of negotiate a way of expressing the kind of fine balance between the fascinating idea of the book, the conceit of the book, along with Pizan's boldness in writing it so publicly when it easily could have gotten her into trouble, possibly, along with the reading experience, which was, at least for me, a bit of a slog. That said, I really wish she could be here to see the world that she helped shape and that she helped contribute to. We're far from the gender equity and parity that we deserve, but I would like to think that this book, in some small way, contributed to the course that we took in getting to where we are. There you go. My take on Christine de Pizan's The Book of the City of Ladies. If you've read it or have any thoughts about it, please leave me a note below. And in the next 3 or 4 weeks, I will be doing my very, very best to play catch up. I have a lot of books to talk about. Just right off camera, I have 3 gigantic piles of books I need to show you, and reviews to catch up on, and everything. So if you like this channel, just stay tuned for the next month or so. I'll be having probably 2 videos or so a week for the next several weeks. So that said, I will let you go. Have a wonderful day. Bye.